Good afternoon. Buenas tardes a todos. My name is Brian, y a todas. My name is Brian Pitts. I'm the Assistant Director of the UCLA Latin American Institute. I'm joined here by our Director, Ruben Hernandez Leon. I would like to welcome you to the latest installment in our year-long lecture series on Paraguay and Bolivia, two of the most fascinating but probably understudied countries in Latin America. Today is an installment in the Paraguay portion of the series, and we are honored to have with us Professor Bridget Chesterton from the State University, sorry, hold on, I've got it here. Uh, we have from Buffalo State University. I would say State University of New York at Buffalo, and
It
Buffalo State
is.
University.
Yeah,
There.
they're two separate schools. It's a little confusing, but we're
And
both SUNY schools.
exactly. Okay. Buffalo State University.
Yes.
Um, and she's a professor in the Department of History and Social Studies Education. Um, she got her PhD in Latin American history from SUNY Stony Brook, and she's published several books on Paraguay. Most notably, her first book in 2013, The Grandchildren of Solano López, Frontier and Nation in Paraguay, 1904 to 1936. She's here today to talk about her current project, Hotel Guaraní, the urbanization and Brazilianization of Paraguay during the Stroessner years. I've been to Paraguay once, and one of the things that I immediately noticed, right, was how many people spoke Portuguese, and the presence of Brazilian businesses and so many influences from Brazilian culture, Brazilian music. And so I'm really fascinated to hear today, just out of a personal interest in hearing about how the country that I studied influenced the country that you study. Professor Chesterton will give us a preview of this book, which is on the verge of coming out. I think you said you're going to be getting the manuscript, the final version of the manuscript to the press this week
Monday.
on Monday, and
Monday.
on Monday, so
Yep.
less than a week away. So yeah, go ahead. Excited. I'm excited to hear about this project.
Okay. Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here and to share my latest research. This is really a project that I have spent almost 13 years of my life researching and thinking about. And it's the fact that it's finally coming to see the light of day is really exciting for me and to share kind of a preview of what the book is. And I want to start off by starting that I'm framing the book around a building. And if you look at the building, it's called the Hotel Guarani. The Hotel Guarani is a is kind of an architecturally interesting building. And the reason it's so interesting is because it was built in Paraguay and it was built as with Brazilian architects, designed by Brazilian architects. And so there, you're beginning to see this influence, and it becomes a symbol in Asunción of both the Stroessner government and its ability to have large infrastructure projects and this sort of Brazilianization of Paraguay. And I'm not going to talk about the hotel in and of itself too much today, but I just kind of wanted to give you some background as to why the title, the Hotel Guarani, because it's not really self-explanatory in this presentation. The book the hotel serves as a metaphor in the book of kind of triangulation of borders and of space and design by Brazilians. So that's kind of what I'm looking at in terms of why the title. And I'm looking at the years of the Stroessner dictatorship. Stroessner was in power from 1954 to 1989. He was the longest South American dictator by far. And when the other dictatorships in Latin America, particularly Brazil and Argentina, were falling, he was able to maintain power. And this was always a question I had in my head. This question of how was Stroessner able to maintain power for so long? And of course, the political scientists have tried to answer this question, and their answer has always been he was authoritarian, he had complete control over the military, his party, and politics, and he was obviously very brutal. His regime was known for disappearances, torture. All of this has been documented in the Archive of Terror in Asunción. And yet, that wasn't a very satisfying answer for me. Because when I talk to Paraguayans, they have some remembrances of the era. that can be quite positive. A lot of things were happening. And so Stroessner and his regime, which was absolutely awful, brought about this sort of change in Paraguay that allowed people, especially the middle classes, so people who were doctors or lawyers or architects or people who were trained at the National University, to kind of get some material comforts that they had never had in Paraguay before. And so he was able to use that sort of um, commodities to strengthen his power. And even though that's not a complete answer to why Stroessner remained in power for so long, it has to do with the dictator. It has to do with absolutely with his authoritarianism, his personality, and of course the regime of terror. And it should be noted, the same people who supported the regime could just as easily be victims of the regime. And that's a really important line to walk because the beneficiaries of the regime were oftentimes also victims. And so it's really very complicated situation and narrative to explain. And you have to be kind of careful because the story is not straightforward. And I hope that I cover this well in my book, because one of the things I do want to explain in my book is that the Stroessner dictatorship had supporters, and they had a certain amount of acquisitive power that they never had before. And so, a lot of people have, over the years been like, well, you must support Stroessner. And I'm like, well, no, that's not where I'm going with this project. I'm just trying to explain what was going on. But basically, Paraguayans have always received this project with a lot of suspicion. They have said to me straight up, are you a supporter of Stroessner or are you not? What is your position? And people I interview want to know immediately where I stand. And I have always said, I'm here to learn about your everyday life, to learn about how you lived during the Stroessner dictatorship, the ins and outs of what was happening. And that's not a great answer. I certainly didn't want to out anybody who was a supporter of the regime. They don't necessarily want to be outed, but they also, not everybody was a victim. There were a lot of beneficiaries. So that's kind of what I'm looking at. It's a complicated project that has taken me a long time to sort of understand. And on top of that, as if that weren't complicated enough, I have this influence of Brazil that I need to understand. And it has taken me an incredible amount of time to learn enough about Brazil to even feel remotely comfortable writing this book. Learning about Brazilian architecture, Brazilian fashion, Brazilian cuisine, Brazilian. And I want to state, Brazil's a lot of things. And historians will gladly tell you that you can't just summarize Brazil as one thing. Paraguayans do. And so as much as Brazilianists are always really like, but that's not quite right, my interpretation is, well, doesn't matter because Paraguayans see Brazil as this big thing with sort of a unified culture that is feijoada, that is also churrascarias, which are two different things from two different regions of the country. They also see it as carnaval, which is obviously Rio. They see it as an industrial power, which is Sao Paulo. So for Paraguayans, Brazil is just this big monolith. And the regionalities and the disputes among Brazilian scholars, which I think are very interesting, and I've spent knee deep in time trying to learn all these different regionalities. And what I realized was Paraguayans don't care. They just see it as a monolith. And so with these certain images in their head. And that's kind of what I wanted to focus on a little bit in the book. I'm not going to have time for that here. Oops, how do I move this forward? So one of the things that I started off is you really need to talk about the geography of the region. And prior to the rise of Stroessner, almost all trade, almost all movement from the colonial period through the middle of the 20th century, traveled out of Asuncion via the river, via Argentina. So everything was looking south. So if you look at the map here, and I love this map because it's from 1944, and I think it's a really precise image. Everything is running south to Argentina. And so Argentina was the dominant cultural player and the dominant economic player in Paraguay from the colonial period all the way through the 1950s. And it's really hard to imagine that anything was going to change in this regard. Paraguay, Argentina dominated Paraguayan politics. They supported Paraguay during the Chaco War. They were major investors in all kinds of things in Argentina. And yet there's a little bit of uncomfortableness with this because the Argentines could always control everything because they were the only outlet. And there was always this discomfort with the reality that everything had to go through Argentina. And so beginning in the 1940s and then the 1950s, there's some political changes that I don't have time to explain in detail. But just to kind of set this up, there are some changes in politics that lead to, and it's a lot of disarray. I should say there's a civil war, there's a lot of disarray. But people begin to talk about Brazil as an opportunity. The reality was, though, there was no way to get there. There was absolutely no way to get from Asuncion to Brazil via road, via air, or via railroad. And so this is a huge problem. And it's a problem for the Brazilians as well, because at this time, Brazil is beginning to see itself as an industrial power, an answer to, a response to Latin America as the power in the Southern Hemisphere. And they're kind of competing with Argentina, which is in decline. Let's face it, Argentina economically, starting in the 1930s, by the 40s, the 50s, it was a mess. Brazil looks relatively stable. Yes, they have a military dictatorship that's going to come in line. But the reality is, and if you look carefully, their international politics stay the same, basically. So yes, there's internal and there is some messiness going on in Brazil, but Argentina just looks way worse. Argentina looks way less stable. And so there's this realignment of Paraguay toward Brazil starting in the 40s with some ideas about road building and whatnot. I have a map, I don't have it here, unfortunately, of some dreams of moving the city east, of Asuncion moving it east towards Brazil, but that doesn't happen until the rise of Stroessner. So this is kind of that image of what culture, what geography, and what is going on as Paraguay looks south from the colonial era to now, to the 1950s. And I like to call this, oops, sorry, this is not working. So this is the city during the colonial era. This is when I call them porteños, because for two reasons. One, because porteños are from Buenos Aires, obviously. Asuncion is a port city, and it is lined up geographically along the river. All trade goes in and out of Asuncion via Buenos Aires, and you can see that all the important buildings are located along the river. And so this is really, really important. This map is from the I forget. Let me check here. I have it up here somewhere. I forget. I think this is from the 1870s. And you can really see that it's a port city and oriented toward Buenos Aires. A little bit later, you have a map from the 1920s. You see that also Asuncion, the greater area, which is shaded in kind of gray, is also along the river. That is the most important part of the city, even in the 1920s. Yes, there's some other places, but basically everything falls off a map as you start to head east. There's almost nothing there. And I use that. Yes, there were plenty of people, there were lots of things, but there was no connection to Brazil whatsoever. And that's kind of the important note. Still a porteño city. By 1978, and this is a big jump, this is 50 years, over 50 years, you begin to see that there's a road, and if you look here, this is the road headed out of Asuncion toward Ciudad del Este. And this is where you begin to see, and if you look carefully, you can see how the city is expanding along the highway toward Brazil. And so you have this really important geographical shift that happened by the 1970s. And what made this happen? Well, it was a lot of Brazilian investment. And the Brazilians put a lot of money and a lot of effort into connecting Asuncion to Paraguay. And Stroessner supported that. So what you see here is road building, what I call roads, bridges, and autos. And what we have here is these are two postcard images that I have. These are from my personal collection. What you have here are the road from Asuncion to the border. You have a bridge that's that's completed in 1965 that connects Foz de Iguaçu, Brazil, to Puerto Stroessner, what it was called during the Stroessner government, which is now called Ciudad del Este. And then you have autos. And I love this image of the automobiles because the Brazilians begin to export a lot of their automobiles that are being built in Brazil by Brazilian industry into Asuncion. And so they're taking advantage of the roads that they built, the bridges that they built with their own with Brazilian financing, the Brazilians, and they are selling automobiles in Asuncion. And this image is a really great, was from a Brazilian magazine. And I'm not even going to try to pronounce the Portuguese because my Portuguese is really bad. But what I love about this image is that you have the Brazilian flag and the Paraguayan flag together over this automobile with this beautiful lady, kind of showing the joining of the two countries together, bringing Simca automobiles, Brazilian automobiles, to Asuncion. And they were paraded around town. The automobiles were paraded around town. There were tractors. There were all kinds of automobiles that Brazilians sent, VWs. And the Paraguayans seemed to be really excited about receiving this new Brazilian influence. And this is really the setup, the kind of infrastructural and geographical shift that I talk about in my book in much more detail. I'm sort of summarizing this because there's a lot going on here as well. There are also some other large infrastructure projects going on in Asuncion. There are, just to give you a brief summary, there are water was put in Asuncion for the first time. So Asuncion had running water by the 1950s, which it didn't have beforehand. So that was under the Stroessner government. Electricity is starting to flow from a dam that the Brazilians helped build that was built in eastern Paraguay called Acaraí. And Acaraí is kind of bringing all this new electricity to Asuncion, which it never had before. So that was also done under the Stroessner government. So there are these, and then the Hotel Guaraní is being built, which is that building, is triangular structure, which is a copy of what's basically going on in Brasilia. And it certainly was inspired by Brasilia and that architectural trend. So there's a lot of things going on here, and Stroessner is making a change looking south to looking toward the east. And this is what makes it happen. And I think Professor Joel Wolfe does the best job of explaining the importance of automobiles in Brazilian culture. And I think because, you know, his book argues basically that with the automobile, Brazilians could go anywhere. And when the automobile arrived in Asuncion, finally, they could go anywhere. They didn't have to be dependent on the river anymore. They were ponteiros. They were those people who used the bridge, right? And so I love that kind of it's a new fluid motion in Paraguay that had never existed before, and it's toward the east. And so this kind of means that for the first time, Brazilian cultural imperialism can sort of take shape. Now, starting in the 1950s, really in the 1940s, there is an establishment of a variety of different Brazilian cultural organizations in Asuncion. And I'm not going to get into them here because I don't have time, but to briefly outline it, the Brazilian embassy and the Brazilian Department of State sent a bunch of teachers, architects, artists to Asuncion to sort of build up this new friendship with Paraguay. And so these cultural organizations are beginning to circulate, and they're sort of influencing the art scene, absolutely beyond the shadow of a doubt. They are influencing. They're trying to make waves into the fashion world. You're starting to see these kind of Brazilian cultural changes, and one of the big changes, and when I first mentioned this to people, they were like, "Oh, yeah, interesting." It had not really occurred to them what had been happening at this time, even though once I mentioned it to them, they're like, yes, that's exactly what was going on. Um, but basically, what ends up happening is there's this really big change in diet in Asuncion. And prior to, you know, the 19, I would say the 1960s, what begins to happen in the 1970s is um, that Brazilian products begin to enter the market in Asuncion. Now, Jose Luis Appleyard is a really famous short story writer from this era, from the 1970s and 80s, and his short stories are really documenting everyday life in Asuncion. And some of his stories are about cultural change. And one of his stories is about the changing everyday diets of Paraguayans. And basically, what he writes is all of these foods that are so Paraguayan, chipa, chipa guasu, sopa, all these Paraguayan dishes, vori vori, these traditional Paraguayan dishes are disappearing, he writes. And what Paraguayans are forced to consume are foods from the supermarket. And these foods are not traditional Paraguayan, and he kind of argues that they're not delicious, they're not healthy, they're not anything to be celebrated, really. And one of the things that he writes, and this is really interesting, is that food now comes from a refrigerator. And that's a really big cultural shift because prior to the building of Guaraní Dam, which I briefly mentioned, there were almost nobody had a refrigerator in Paraguay. And if they did, it was a kerosene refrigerator. Kerosene refrigerators are complicated to use and they also blow up. So they're a little dangerous and they make terrible ice. I love that. They make terrible ice. Everybody says that. They make terrible ice. And Brazilian refrigerators begin to arrive with the opening of the bridge, with the arrival of electricity in Asuncion from Guaraní Dam. And this is a huge shift in the way that Paraguayan consumers can both, middle class Paraguayan consumers can both shop. And they are no longer dependent on goods coming in from Argentina. Now, this takes time. But Appleyard was picking up on a really important cultural shift. And that cultural shift is to canned and products. And the one thing he has a meltdown about in this short story is the stuffed tomato. And so the stuffed tomato becomes a symbol of everything that is wrong with this new Paraguayan food. And there are recipes for the stuffed tomato everywhere in the 1970s and the 1980s in Asuncion. And so what are these stuffed tomatoes stuffed with, right? I mean, it's kind of like, well, you need stuffed tomatoes, you need tomatoes, you need olives, you need canned tuna or sardines, you need eggs, you need certain condiments, you need certain things that are packaged pre-good items. And the Brazilians at this point are beginning to import a large amount of food products into Paraguay. And they are slowly replacing the Argentine products that consumers had been familiar with on some level. But this is an onslaught of new Brazilian kind of goods and commodities that hadn't really been seen before. And one of the things that you have to do when you have these new commodities is you have to have people to teach you how to use them, right? So there are these incredible amount of cookbooks and newspapers and cooking schools that begin to flourish in Asuncion. And I have an article about cooking in Paraguay during the Stroessner dictatorship, but this is a little bit different than what I have already published. And what I'm saying here is that these Brazilian commodities begin to shape the Paraguayan diet in a really interesting way. But how? right? So these are advertisements from newspapers. This is from 1979. In this one here, there are you can't really read it, and I apologize for that. But there, I love the Farrah Fawcett hairdo. I just love that. And these are basically Argentine products that are being advertised in the newspaper. So there's a familiarity with Argentine products, but Brazilians need consumers to know their products, right? They need to do this. And so there's an onslaught of marketing campaigns by Brazilian companies, really starting in the late 1970s. I would say a little earlier, early 1970s through the 1980s, really, that begins to look at Brazilian food commodities. And how do they do this, right? Did I skip one? Yes. Okay. This is Doña Clara. Doña Clara is she is the Doña Petrona of Argentina, of Paraguay. She's the Doña Petrona of Argentina, or as Rebecca Pite argues, the female cooking economica from Argentina who influenced Argentine diets incredibly. This is Paraguay's answer to Doña Petrona. And there are really two of them, but she becomes much more famous, Doña Clara. She is a widow. She becomes widowed. She has a younger daughter. Her younger daughter needs her support. She has no way to make a living. And so she starts her own cooking school and she's self-taught. She becomes the name to go to learn to cook. Now, Doña Clara is becoming really famous for her schools in Asunción. And the Brazilian company Walita, which makes blenders and all kinds of kitchen domestic appliances, hires her to come to Sao Paulo and to teach at their institute in Sao Paulo. And so Doña Clara begins commuting to Sao Paulo. She with her daughter pretty regularly. And I've talked to Sarita, and Sarita remembers this very vividly. She learned to speak Portuguese when she was there. It was a really exciting time for her, even though it was hard because her mother, it was hard because they were traveling back and forth. But her mother begins to also promote Brazilian products at about the same time. So these advertising agencies in Asunción begin promoting these products. And Arisco is one of them. And so here we have these Brazilian products that are being touted by Paraguay's most important chef. She is the name behind all of these really important cooking things during the Stroessner dictatorship. Her schools are the most elite schools for Paraguayan women where you can learn to cook. And she is using Brazilian products in her cooking school, beyond the shadow of a doubt. She's also, and this is a little bit harder to track. I haven't had much luck with this, but she's also using a lot of domestic appliances, and the blender is one of them. She eventually has her own cooking show, and it's kind of, there are some Argentine products in there, but a lot more Brazilian products that she's kind of pushing. And so these are her products, and this is how that marketing sort of happens in Asunción. So here we have another Brazilian company, and this is from the newspaper as well. And here you have all these lovely Brazilian products. What I love about these Brazilian products is all of the labels are in Portuguese. So they didn't bother to translate the labels from Portuguese into Spanish when they were importing these goods. So, things like abacaxi, which is pineapple, or piña in Paraguayan Spanish, is just abacaxi. And so that they don't really seem to care, whatever it is. They also have a variety of products, including feijoada in a can, which I could not imagine as being delicious, but let's just go with they were selling it. And it had just feijoada on it. So it was assumed that either Paraguayans knew what feijoada was, or we're going to find out, because nowhere is that translated on the can. And so these products really begin to circulate and to make an impact, and they advertise heavily in the Paraguayan newspapers. I love this one. This is a really clear example of not translating the label. And of course, they're peas, and it's in Portuguese. And nova, it says it like it's new in Portuguese. They don't even bother. And here they're giving you a recipe of how to use these peas. So we have basically creamed peas. And these are Paraguayan products Brazilian products that are being sold in Paraguay. They also held contests where you could collect the labels, and you would get, like, if you bought a certain brand, you would have access to certain like Revlon products if you turned in the labels, things like that. There were these promotions that were really pushed in the advertising world. And so what I love about this, and it's really interesting, is that by the time Stroessner leaves power, or is removed from power, let's put it that way, it's this change in Paraguayan diets is really clear in the middle classes. And these products are all over supermarket shelves in Asunción. And this also goes along with Brazilian cleaning products, most famously Bribón and Omo dishwash, Omo soap, and all these kinds of products that are just flooding the Paraguayan market. And this happened precisely because there was a change in geography. And so Paraguayan consumers, for the first time, have access to what are, generally speaking, less expensive Brazilian products than the Argentine product. These are much less expensive. And you can particularly see this with in fashion. And Brazilian fashion really doesn't make its way in until the very late 70s and the early 80s. But Brazilian fashion, particularly the bikini, becomes a hot commodity in Asunción. Everybody wanted a Brazilian bikini, and they sold like hotcakes. I have oral testimonies of women saying, I couldn't bring enough bathing suits from Brazil to sell in Asunción. They just sold out. That doesn't mean that there wasn't some reluctance towards these new products, and I should be clear about that. There was always a little bit of concern that these products were not as good as Argentine products. Argentine products were always a little bit better, considered a little bit better than Brazilian cheaper products. I would say today that has completely gone away, that nobody considers Brazilian products to be of any less quality than Argentine products. But at the time, there was a little bit of resistance, and it took some advertising, and it took a lot of years of promoting these Brazilian products in Asunción and getting customers accustomed to Brazilian fashion, which is much more colorful, much sexier, let's just say, than Argentine fashion, which was always considered very reserved, very kind of monochrome compared to what the Brazilians were selling or bringing into the country. Like I said, though, today, nobody blinks an eye at Brazilian fashion and Brazilian products. And what's really hilarious is that you start to know, when you look at the table in Asunción, when you're at a restaurant, you'll always get a container of Arisco hot sauce. It's always on the table, and it's that brand, right? And so an Omo dishwashing soap, laundry detergent is everywhere. Whether you want it or not. I think the whole city smells of Omo. It makes me laugh. And the Brazilianization really occurred because it was searched out, and the Brazilians really did a good job of marketing themselves and paying for these infrastructure projects that changed the direction of Asunción. And I should note, all of these years before the 1940s, when they were looking towards Argentina, there was a lot of concern about, Argentine stability. And Brazil just looked more stable as opposed to Argentina, which just looked like it was falling apart. And that was reassuring to the Stroessner regime. So with a bridge and autos and some consumer commodities, things really changed in Asunción. And so that's kind of the bigger project. I've skipped a lot, so I apologize if I didn't fill in any of the gaps quite beautifully well. But I think I'll stop it right here, and let's see, hold on. Just let me, I think I have one more slide. Oh, I want to say thank you to UCLA Latin American Institute, the UCLA Center for Brazilian Studies, the History Department at UCLA, el Comité Paraguayo de Ciencias Históricas, who have supported me in so many ways and have come to my rescue physically, emotionally, and academically on multiple occasions. They're a wonderful group of Paraguayan scholars who have always supported my research, and without them, this project would have been impossible. I also thank my family, my friends, and you all for listening. I should note that, and I always like to say this, none of this would have been possible without my mother and my father, who supported me, who gave me childcare, and who took care of me after I was had an accident in Asunción, and of course my husband, who keeps supporting me on these crazy projects. So thank you for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I learned a ton. I had no idea that sort of the interest of Brazilian companies expanding internationally, along with Stroessner's attempt to gain support and hold on to power, and like increasing Paraguayan distrust of Argentina, they all sort of like came together right at the same time, and created this really unique dynamic. A couple of things you said just I thought were funny. You talked about the labels all being in Portuguese. When I was actually first exposed to Portuguese, the kind of the very beginning of my becoming a Brazilianist, when I was a kid and I lived in Bolivia. My parents were missionaries there, and we would order our breakfast cereal. We would order the breakfast cereal was all made in Brazil, right? And all the boxes were in Portuguese. And so trying to like read, Portuguese on cornflakes and frosted flakes, I guess, was sucrilhos, as Brazilians call them. That was how I got my first exposure to Portuguese, and of course the embalaging, the packaging was completely untranslated. It was all in Portuguese. I also thought too, it's kind of it's Brazilians might be insulted that Paraguayans had a sort of monolithic image of Brazil, but they can't be too insulted because Brazilians have a monolithic image of Paraguay, right? And the only thing, like there's one thing that any Brazilian you talk to today, at least, associates Paraguay with, and that is cheap electronics.
I was going to say Itaipu, but close enough.
Because you go to Ciudad del Este, right, to
Este,
buy
yeah.
the Paraguayan productos piratados, right? The that's sort of the Brazilian stereotype. But Paraguay is like that's where you go to get a cheap blender, actually. So we've come full circle, right? Instead of the Brazilian blenders coming to Paraguay, now Brazilians go to Paraguay to get their blenders.
No, it's true. I mean, this study really doesn't, and I have to, I should clarify, I didn't do a borderland study in this project. And there is a borderland aspect to this, which can certainly be incorporated. I sort of stayed away from that to show a much larger influence in Asunción, in the center of the country. It was kind of a choice. But there are wonderful scholars who do work on the Brazilianization of Paraguay by Brazilian colonists, actual colonists who came with Itaipu, Jacob Blanc, and there are wonderful studies, I think, that really hone in on this borderland area. Lovely. So I don't want to repeat that. I'm trying to show a larger Brazilian question. A larger Brazilian project than just borderlands, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Ruben, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you, Bridget, this wonderful presentation, a super interesting project. I think that there are, many interesting parallels that we can establish between large and smaller countries, neighboring countries all over the world, where the bigger countries sort of cast their shadow and influence on those countries. But I wanted to ask you actually about the title of the book and the image that, is, if I understood correctly, is the image that you will be
Sure.
using in the cover of
Yeah.
your forthcoming book. And if you could tell us just a little bit more about, in your talk is called Hotel Guaraní. So if you can tell us a little bit more of the story of that hotel that is actually in the middle, in the center of Asunción,
Yeah.
and why, what sort of the connection, the inspiration for calling your book Hotel Guaraní, and why is this building, part of the sort of the built environment in Asunción? Why does it figure so prominently in your understanding of these processes?
So, as I kind of skimmed through rather briefly, basically one of the things about the Hotel Guarani, it was built, Stroessner went to Brasilia in the late 1950s. He was there for a few hours, actually. And he was shown around the developing city of Brasilia. He was very excited about what he saw. The Brazilian newspapers reported on this pretty extensively. And what he saw in Brasilia was this huge hotel. It was a huge hotel where he had a show and a dinner, and it was international, and it was modern, and it was very and Stroessner says, we want Asunción to be that, right? We want Brazil to be that. I mean, we want Paraguay to be Brasilia. And so at this point, what's happening is the architecture school in Asunción, and just to give you a brief, this is really brief. The architecture school was founded by based on some Uruguayan techniques and whatnot, but pretty quickly gets overrun by Brazilian architects, and in particular de Britos, who was a Brazilianist, who had studied, who had worked with the Brazilian architect who designed, this is not coming to me because I need it. But he was able to work with Paraguayan students, and he took them to Brasilia as well with Oscar Niemeyer. Sorry, he took these Paraguayan students, there were 16 of them, I think, to Brasilia to study, to look around and to look. And that was all paid for by the Brazilian embassy paid for all of this. They met Niemeyer, they came back, they were really inspired. And so this really new generation of Paraguayan architects are really influenced by this Brasilia style and this sort of modernist movement. And so the Hotel Guarani, even though it wasn't designed by Paraguayans, because there had been none that had graduated from the School of Architecture in Asunción by the time they needed this building done, the design contest was won by Brazilians. And they placed it in this, and it was to be the center of the city where people could come and congregate. And that place during the 1960s and 70s becomes a place where you get your picture taken. So in front of the building. So there are a treasure trove. I mean, there are just gajillions of them, and there are amazing pictures of people getting their picture taken in front of the Hotel Guarani. And that becomes ingrained in Paraguayan, like, this is ours. Even though the vast majority of people couldn't set foot in the Hotel Guarani because it's pretty elite, it was a 5-star hotel, it's theirs, right? It's the Guarani, it's their building. And they're very proud of it. And they want their picture taken in front of it. So, it's a Brazilian designed building with a Paraguayan name, right? And it's this sort of tension between the modernism and what Paraguayans have access to and what they don't have access to. It's a really complicated space. But these pictures are unbelievable. I must have seen hundreds of them just floating around. Everybody had their picture taken in front of the Hotel Guarani. And it becomes a central point, right? Where in 1972, there's an architectural conference that is hosted, an Pan American International Conference that is hosted at the Hotel Guarani. It's a big event. Architects from all over Latin America come to the Hotel Guarani and experience Asunción through the Hotel Guarani. And it was designed to attract Brazilian tourists. That was the hope, that it would attract Brazilian tourists.
Thank you.
I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does.
I see we have a question from the audience as well. Sean Austin is asking,
Hi, Sean.
do you have any commercial or consumption stories related to Paraguayan yerba mate, and Brazilian and the Brazilian chimarrão trade? So all different names for the same thing, I guess. But
So No, I don't. I don't ever see Brazilian yerba mate or caja in Paraguay ever. Um, and I think that's because um, that is a very Paraguayan product, and Paraguayans are attached to the flavor of their yerba mate.
I mean,
Um,
it'd be like Mexicans importing American tortillas, right?
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not, you really don't see it. And there's really very little advertising for yerba mate during this era. And my guess is because it didn't need to be advertised. And I did, I would look for advertisements for yerba mate because Rebecca Pite asked me to look for them. She was doing this book on yerba mate at the same time. And she said, if you find anything, can you just take them? And I was like, oh, sure, no big deal. So you don't see a lot of advertisements for yerba mate. And my guess is like you just didn't need to advertise yerba mate. Why would you? It's sold on its own. Um, that's a great question. And you also don't see Argentine yerba mate either. From Misiones or anything like that. That's a very local domestic product. What you do see is Brazilian coffee. And I have a section in the book on Brazilian coffee. And that does become increasingly important for that Brazilianization as Brazil has markets finds markets in Paraguay for their coffee. So that's more of a thing. And Guaraní really, as you may know, doesn't really become a product for export in Paraguay until the 80s and 90s. So this was way before Guaraní or stevia becomes a product. Thanks.
Oh, that's what it is. Okay.
Sorry, I should have said stevia. Guaraní. Yeah.
So I guess I had an additional question about kind of the political implications. I studied the Brazilian dictatorship. So, if you think about like the way that, well, certainly in Chile, right, there's still a pretty sizable contingent of Chileans that like swear by Pinochet, right, or from a certain social class and a certain political orientation. And in recent years, there's been like a sizable, well, not sizable, but at least a not insignificant contingent of Brazilians, that wax nostalgic about Brazil's military dictatorship. But the reaction you said you got from Paraguayans, right? It was like this sort of like suspicion that maybe you liked Stroessner. And is it still taboo to have, or is there anyone who like publicly copped to being an admirer of the Stroessner regime in
Oh,
Paraguay, or is seen pretty universally negatively?
no, there are politicians who align themselves with Stroessner pretty clearly. Most people are hesitant, I think, because there's a little bit of shame involved in this still. Um, but there are plenty of people who support them, who support Stroessner's dictatorship quite clearly. Not everybody was embarrassed. I just don't want to out anybody who didn't want their name to be shared. Um, and I think the reality is, I didn't really ask these kinds of questions either. That would kind of come up in conversation in terms of like, well, when I was shopping, things were easier to shop for. There was no crime. It was easy. Life was better. It wasn't like outright support that they would tell me in their oral interviews. But yeah, there were people who did support it. But at the same time, there were plenty of people who were horrified by the Stroessner regime and the memory of the Stroessner regime. Um, you know, and would say so, but also wanted their voices to be understood. So it's kind of a conflicting thing still. I think it's a lot like Chile in that regard, or Brazil, or Argentina for that. I mean, Malay, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Ruben, I saw you had your hand raised as well.
Uh, yes, again, just to invite our audience. And I actually see a question. If I can, I was going to ask a question, but I'm going to read the question from Do Kim, who's a graduate student in geography, if it's okay with you, Brian.
Sure.
Do writes, last summer, while on a brief research trip, I was in the dance event where Brazilian university cultural groups presented together with the Paraguayan groups in the square in front of the Hotel Guaraní. Would you share your opinion on cultural receptivity of Brazilian ways in Asunción?
That's a complicated question. So I would have to start with The art scene. I have a whole chapter on art, and the art scene is a very complicated thing to explain, because it was so heavily, it has been and continues to be really influenced by Brazilian norms. And there was a Brazilian who came to Asunción, Livio Aramo, who worked the art scene and influenced generations of Paraguayan artists. Um, I would say that there is a acceptance of Brazilian culture. Um, there is a celebration of Brazilian carnival. They know it's Brazilian carnival. There was always carnival in Asunción, but really starting in the 1960s, it becomes in the 1970s, really 70s, it was a big push. It becomes more carioca, more Rio kind of celebrations. And the Brazilians like to take credit for teaching Paraguayans how to do this, how to celebrate Carnival. I have a whole article on that in a Brazilian newspaper, which is fascinating. Um, and so, what is the reception? Um, I think at first it was a little bit of reluctance because it was new. But I would say that today, Brazilian cultural influence is pretty well accepted and understood, especially in the art scene. Um, it's like I said, Livia Abramo really shaped the modern art scene in Asunción beyond the shadow of a doubt to this day. Um, they're really, I mean, there were other Paraguayan artists, absolutely, before Livia Abramo, but he really trained generations of Paraguayan artists. I don't know if that answers the question, uh, but I think you'd have to really read the art chapter to really understand that. In terms of dance, I don't have anything on dance per se, really. I'd focus on the visual arts, but I would say, yeah, friendly interchange, absolutely.
You think I kind of have a question kind of related to that actually that I was planning on asking as well. General, it's certainly among the Latin American left politically and academically as well. There's this very long-standing and justified critique of sort of U.S. imperialism, right?
Mhm.
Does the Paraguayan left talk about Brazilian imperialism to the extent that there is a left in Paraguay?
Um, Not as much, but yes, there is an understanding of it. The United States always plays an outside role, an oversized role, excuse me, for, what happened during the Cold War. And one of the things I do in this book purposefully, and I should note this, is I really play down US influences in politics and in international relations and US dollars, because I wanted to show the Brazilian colonization kind of process. And I was a little wary of, there is a Cold War discussion, but I also think that other scholars have done this better than I could. There are plenty of studies out there that talk about the Cold War in Paraguay and U.S. intervention, which there was plenty. The U.S. built the airport in Asunción, for example. That's just one example.
Mm.
Um, but I really wanted to show Brazilian power and Brazilian money in a way that hasn't been explained before. And I really wanted to show how many crusados were coming across for these infrastructure projects. Um, and that doesn't mean that the US wasn't involved. Oh, they were. Um, and but I was really much more interested, and I would recommend that Kurt Kaivella's book on the dictator dilemma, to really answer that question a little bit better than I could, because I think that does a better treatment than what I currently do in my own book. If that would be really a better place to look for that answer. Um, yeah. Um, I really kind of admittedly said, I'm not going to do this because it's
Mhm.
going to become,
A
and
book
Brazilian,
a book that's already been written many times over for other countries, right?
yeah. And I was like, I don't want to write that story. I really want to talk about Brazil. And I really want to talk about, this sub-imperialism that was being developed in Brazil.
Yeah. Ruben, did you have any other questions you wanted to jump in with?
I mean, it's connected to this discussion, and you use actually a term that it just kind of continues the sort of reflection conversation around these. What I've heard from my Paraguayan friends a kind of distrust or concern about this sort of Brazilian sub-imperialism. You use the term sub-imperialism
Yeah.
just right now. And so I guess my question was about the kinds of pushbacks on maybe the fronts that you can talk about to this kind of Brazilian influence on Paraguay, right? I think you mentioned along the lines of the food front that some people did not like this idea that the food that Paraguayans were consuming was coming from the supermarkets as opposed to the traditional food that was maybe prepared at home with the traditional methods, et cetera, et cetera. But I also heard, Paraguayans complain about the sort of takeover of, Paraguayan lands on the border. All these things that are maybe
Mhm.
quite familiar in certain circles. But more generally, again, what kinds of pushback or pushbacks were you able to trace as you were studying these processes of influence of regional hegemonic or influence in general, right? On this, between this, regional power, which is Brazil, and a much smaller and less institutionally capable country like Paraguay.
So, this question about Brasileños, which are the people who have colonized Paraguay on the eastern frontier, um, it's a great question. It really starts with the flood of Itaipu, and Jacob Blanc really has really done a good job of understanding that. There are also some other historians who have worked on that, and also I wanted to stay away from that. I know you're like, stayed away from everything. And I'm like, but there was a really conscious decision on my part not to do a borderland study. Um, because I really wanted to show this kind of larger imperial project, right? And I really wanted to show Brazil in a much bigger light than just borderlands. Because I don't think that studying the borderlands gives us a full picture of how big this Brazilianization was.
Mm.
Um, and I think that also comes later in my story. It would come later and really in the 70s and the 80s with Itaipu Dam. Um, you know, Prior to Itaipu, there was a much smaller dam called Acaraí, which I mentioned, um, and Eastern Paraguay. And the Brazilians designed it and helped fund it. And one of the things about this project is that it really was the first time that Brazil really connected Paraguay. Like it was a jump in, and that did happen on the borderlands, but it's felt in Asunción. And I really wanted to show Brazilian power away from the border, because I just kind of feel this question of Brasileños is a really complicated, messy, ugly um, colonization project that, yeah, people push back against. Absolutely. This is a little less push back against this, what I'm describing here. Because these things made life better for the average, for the middle class Paraguayan. And I think that's what I was trying to focus on was how did life change in Asunción as a result of that? Um, the borderlands are fascinating. I just didn't really do that. And
Mm.
it was a conscious decision.
Mhm.
Because, and I mentioned Brasileños, and I think they're really important. And I think that um, Keith Hetherington has written about them. And there's some really wonderful work on this as well in the borderlands and things like that. But I really just wanted to talk about Brazilian influence kind of in the cultural center. because it hadn't been looked at really. And it's much more powerful than just the borderlands. It was pretty big.
Is
And I
pretty
think that's
big.
what's surprising, right? Is how big this project was. It wasn't just about borderlands at all. Yeah. I don't know if
Thank
that makes
you.
any sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Thank you.